Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Insider, How the Kiplinger Newsletter Bridged Washington and Wall Street, by Rob Wells. Narrated by Jonathan Todd Ross. Introduction. Willard Kiplinger sat quietly in the corner of a spacious office in the State, War, and Navy Building, now known as the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, next to the White House. A veteran newspaper reporter, Kiplinger knew when to ask questions and when to shut up. At this point, it was time to listen, since his host, Raymond Moley, was talking on the telephone with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In 1933, this is what Kiplinger did most Friday afternoons: stop by Moley's office, trade information about what business leaders were saying about the New Deal, gossip about Capitol Hill politics, and discuss which cabinet members were causing problems. It was also an occasion for Moley to vent and to preview some of the most controversial aspects of the New Deal, policies that would forever change the relationship between government and business. My instinct told me he could be trusted, and I told him all I knew. Moley wrote about Kiplinger. Later he told me that he was alarmed at my frankness. Sometimes debates about the direction of the New Deal took place right in front of Kiplinger. Various officials might break in to interrupt their meeting and discuss sensitive matters with Moley. Kiplinger, a well-groomed man with a trim mustache and dark suit, blended in well, looking like the typical businessman he wrote for. Kiplinger might have concealed his face by raising a newspaper, pretending to read. Make no mistake about it, he was there to listen. Moley's office was at the epicenter of the New Deal. By his account, this is where the National Industrial Recovery Act first began to take shape, a radical new system of industrial regulation and a risky bet to stabilize and transform U.S. business conduct. Moley was a Columbia University law professor who headed Roosevelt's Brains Trust, a group of elite professors, primarily from Columbia University, who helped conceive the New Deal during the 1932 presidential campaign. Moley's power was so significant in early 1933 that one administration official described him as, for all practical purposes, a cabinet in one person. Moley was among a handful of men in the Treasury Secretary's office in March 1933 as the Roosevelt administration, in an attempt to stop bank runs from spreading nationwide, shut down the U.S. banking system and created a week-long national banking holiday, which successfully averted the crisis. Moley spent hours with Roosevelt drafting the speeches and helping sort out the new path for regulating business. Moley, after all, said he came up with the term the New Deal. The New Deal, by empowering organized labor, reining in Wall Street, and creating programs such as Social Security, forever changed the relationship between business and the federal government. So it is no wonder that in 1933, Washington was besieged by anxious chief executives of automobile factories, steel mills, and dress manufacturers seeking to learn how the New Deal would curtail their operations or provide new opportunities. Some worried that the new president was out to kill free markets and push the United States into socialism. Labor unions were celebrating and signing up new members at a rapid clip, emboldened by federal support for their organizing activities. During this time, it seemed as if everyone wanted to see Moley. He was in such demand that a joke circulated around Washington. "Franklin, can you do me just one favor? Can you get me an appointment with Moley?" Kiplinger had a standing meeting with Moley each week, a major journalistic coup. One reason was that Moley also found the visits beneficial, since Kiplinger possessed a deep knowledge of Washington, its history, and its unusual culture. Kiplinger had reported on 4 presidents since 1916, and was the rare journalist fluent in the languages of politics and finance. He kept me informed about what was going on in Washington beyond my own constricted area of work. He saved me many a mistake, Moley wrote of Kiplinger. He, Kiplinger, knew Washington after having lived there for 17 years. I knew what the new administration was thinking about and planning, and so every busy week that spring and summer, I set aside an hour on Friday afternoons for a talk with Kip. Kiplinger was extremely valuable to Moley in another respect. The 4-page Kiplinger Washington Letter was closely read by business executives and other journalists. As a business journalist broadly sympathetic to the New Deal, Kiplinger could help the administration advance its goals and potentially dampen business opposition. Reliable information about the New Deal was scarce in the early days of the Roosevelt administration. The daily newspapers offered a confusing tick-tock of coverage about the major changes passed by Congress, but not the analysis of the impact. Even members of Congress were confused and struggled to gain insight into how the major employers were supposed to boost wages and hire more people, and still somehow stay in business. Readers of the no-nonsense Kiplinger Washington Letter would find some startling information about debates happening inside the Oval Office, Roosevelt's living room in Hyde Park, and Moley's Washington office. As a result, circulation rose 458% between 1930 and 1933, to 18,535 subscribers as the newsletter's reporting became very popular with business executives trying to comprehend the government's response to the Depression. We do not hesitate to say that we consider this service as valuable to us as anything else we subscribe to, said W. E. Weitzel, president of the First National Company in Trenton, New Jersey, in a 1935 letter to Kiplinger. The bank made beneficial securities trades based on Kiplinger's reporting. In fact, it has more than paid for itself on several occasions. The Kiplinger Washington Letter didn't quote Moley, or anyone else for that matter, because Kiplinger believed he would get better information if he allowed business leaders and government officials to speak to him without attribution. This was one of his insights from his days as a reporter for the Associated Press from 1913 to 1919, including a 3-year stint in the Washington Bureau, where he wound up specializing in business and economics. As Moley recalled, I believed that he knew what to print and what should be kept on background. These meetings with Moley were an example of the insight Kiplinger was able to gain into the New Deal, which, in turn, led to the expanded popularity of the Kiplinger Washington Letter. Business executives found that the letter could help them interpret Washington news and manage the information explosion of the day. Situated on different perches, Moley in the White House orbit and Kiplinger interacting with the city's power elite, the two men in varying degrees influenced the country's response to the Great Depression, the economic disaster from 1929 through 1933, regarded as the most severe economic contraction in U.S. history. Output of goods and services declined by 1/3, and nearly 1/4 of U.S. workers had lost their jobs by May 1933. The historian David Hamilton summarized the carnage. Between 1929 and 1933, 5,000 American banks collapsed, 1 in 4 farms went into foreclosure, and an average of 100,000 jobs vanished each week. Causes of the Great Depression were numerous and complex, but the economist Peter Temin traced the origins to a global economic shock from World War I, which altered international debt arrangements and created a boom and bust in demand for U.S. exports of food and fiber. The fall in demand for farm produce was compounded by a post-war deflation, which served to accelerate farm debts. There had been no downturn of its magnitude or duration before, and there has been none since. It stands as a unique failure of the industrial economy, Temin wrote. Moley was a central player in the Roosevelt administration's attempts to halt this economic crisis and rein in corporate excesses. In broad terms, the New Deal at first sought to stabilize the banking system and impose new controls on what businesses could produce and what they could charge, as well as workers' hours and wages. The idea involved limiting predatory price competition, curbing excessive supply, and raising worker pay to stimulate demand. These were the outlines of the National Industrial Recovery Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the two major interventions in business that Congress passed hurriedly in the spring of 1933. The New Deal created significant uncertainty in the business community, and many executives traveled to Washington that spring to speak firsthand to leaders in the new administration. The calamity in the economy had an ironic benefit for Kiplinger. The Great Depression and Roosevelt's New Deal created such a demand for information that it proved to be a boon for the Kiplinger Washington Letter, which had been founded in 1923. By 1925, its circulation was 1,179, and it grew slowly until 1929, then jumped to 18,535 subscribers in 1933. John Ryerson, a longtime Kiplinger editor, recalled that the demand for the newsletter was driven by businessmen who began to see they needed to follow what was going on in Washington. Mission of this book. The Insider shows how Kiplinger, a pioneer in specialized journalism, served as a crucial link between conservative business leaders and government regulators during the New Deal, how he bridged the worlds of Presidents Hoover and Roosevelt. Kiplinger's influence came at a momentous time in the nation's economic history, the depths of the Great Depression, when the very notion of free markets and the future of capitalism were being questioned. Kiplinger's journalism explained the New Deal to a business community that had lost political stature during this economic disaster. Rather than pander to his business audience, Kiplinger repeatedly told these senior corporate leaders that a new order was in place. Laissez-faire economics was dead and regulation was necessary. Kiplinger helped advance democracy and the rise of modern capitalism by arguing that corporations needed new regulatory structures to curtail their power. Private industry has demonstrated it cannot govern itself in the public interest without some kind of direction, regulation, or supervision from above, he wrote. Government, therefore, must supply the control. Kiplinger, in the summer of 1933, was openly advocating for businesses to comply with the National Recovery Act, describing the necessity of all of us cooperating for the common good. He urged businesses to engage in the political system and become decent corporate citizens, thus furthering democratic goals. Kiplinger's reporting embodied associationalism, which promoted business stability through self-regulation and voluntary cooperation by way of trade associations. The case study of Kiplinger's actions during this period serves to highlight the political and historical importance of trade publications in shaping policy debates. Kiplinger was part of a movement that envisioned business leaders in broader roles in the public sphere, and sought to empower them to reform capitalism and make businesses more accountable. The Insider, with its focus on Kiplinger's remarkable work during the New Deal, aims to shed additional light on the little-researched field of commercial newsletters, the trade press, and business journalism in general. This book is timely given the widespread use of newsletters by major news organizations such as the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, and many others. The Kiplinger Washington Letter was highly influential in the field of specialized journalism as it represented a new stylistic departure for business journalism, one that blended explanatory and analytical writing, both emergent trends in journalism at the time. Kiplinger took it a step further by offering forecasts. This new blend of reporting, analysis, and forecasting was a rejection of the rigid stenographic style of daily journalism in that era. The newsletter synthesized and forecast Washington business, economic, and political news for busy business executives in a novel, compact writing style that emphasized brevity. He innovated with close reader engagement and performed a type of early crowdsourcing that anticipated the active audience interaction of digital journalism. These developments, along with his advances in direct marketing, influenced the multi-billion-dollar industry of specialized information, as well as mainstream publications from Newsweek and U.S. News and World Report to Bloomberg, Axios, and others. Why this history matters. This untold history of the Kiplinger Washington Letter and its influence during the New Deal is relevant as our society grapples with questions about the role of journalism in a democratic society. Kiplinger left the sidelines of traditional objective journalism, the straight news reporting in which the journalist is a passive observer, to explore more analytical forms of writing and reporting in order to tell the deeper truths about the intersection of government and business. Similar concerns about the limits of objective journalism have been debated in our era as journalists covered the Black Lives Matter movement and the endemic corruption of the Donald Trump administration. Straight news reporting addresses only the top layers of these complex matters. It is fascinating that Kiplinger, covering President Woodrow Wilson's administration, found traditional straight news reporting insufficient to inform society about the complexity of government activities. Kiplinger's approach is instructive for the chattering class of modern cable news commentators. He produced analysis, yet it arose from a highly rigorous reporting process, applying the skepticism and independence of a traditional journalist. He used those reporting skills to sift and process the onslaught of information in his day: news, spin, rumors, propaganda. He was not offering the empty cable news commentary of today. Kiplinger demonstrated his independence as a business journalist by resisting the party line of an emerging neoconservative movement, the American Liberty League, with its millionaire businessmen who bankrolled an extensive free market propaganda campaign, much like, more recently, the Koch brothers. Furthermore, the insider offers an important perspective on the ongoing debate about whether capitalism and democracy are compatible. A concentration of corporate power, rising wealth inequality, and the debate over a living wage are among the issues prompting questions, yet again, about the fairness and equity of modern capitalism. Kiplinger stood out in his era by supporting capitalism, but insisting that businesses consider their obligations as members of civil society. Businesses needed to participate in the democratic process and accept compromises, he wrote, such as working with organized labor. In that sense, this book offers another dimension to the ongoing debate about the nature of liberty that is severely dividing our society. Conservative business leaders' defense of the laissez-faire economic order, in which individual rights reign supreme over societal priorities, reflects the bitter debate during the COVID-19 pandemic when individuals refused to wear masks or take vaccines, claiming an infringement of their individual liberties. This same argument was playing out in the corporate sphere in the 1930s, as Kiplinger and others sought to persuade recalcitrant corporations to accept government oversight for the common good. We learn from Kiplinger how a journalist can participate in the political space without being an explicit partisan. Kiplinger's agenda was functional in nature, meant to repair a society devastated by the Great Depression, describe a new world order for businesses, and help capitalism evolve into a more modern era. Journalist as political actor. During the New Deal, Kiplinger emerged as a credible individual in both the business and political worlds, thanks to his specialized knowledge of finance and business and his access to key actors. He was a confidant to Hoover and to several of Roosevelt's top advisors, such as Moley, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, and Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, Jr. Kiplinger's career encompassed varied experiences, reporting for the Ohio State Journal in 1912, then the Associated Press in Columbus and Washington, followed by a career change in 1919, working for the National Bank of Commerce as a Washington representative. That led Kiplinger to launch his own private Business Intelligence Bureau in 1920, focusing on business issues in the capital, which in turn spawned the Kiplinger Washington Letter. By the time Roosevelt took the oath of office in 1933, Kiplinger, age 42, had been immersed in the Washington political culture for some 17 years. This book contributes to a broader line of scholarship, arguing that journalists like Kiplinger should be viewed as political actors. Kiplinger was engaged in the political process, but his journalism wasn't slanted toward one party. He worked behind the scenes, mediating and advising, seeking to improve government operations, and allowing for the smooth functioning of the business-government relationship. Extensive correspondence with Moley, some 140 letters exchanged between 1932 and 1966, reveals that Kiplinger was trying to help the Roosevelt administration succeed by counseling administration officials, suggesting policy improvements and, at times, even mediating disputes. In 1934, for example, Kiplinger advised Moley about the political benefits of having Roosevelt acknowledge business concerns with the New Deal and reverse business leaders' negative sentiment. Roosevelt should meet with a group of businessmen and seek their input on economic recovery policies, Kiplinger told him. Such a plan would make a play to the business interests to show them that he really wants their help. Such meetings could be highly publicized or private, Kiplinger continued, adding, "Perhaps it would be better to start it quietly, and not until after the 1934 midterm elections." Kiplinger added that he planned to begin speaking about this idea with his business contacts, and would write about it in the Kiplinger Washington Letter. Discounting the ultra-conservatives with their lack of imagination, and giving maximum weight to a lot of truly liberal businessmen who are, or could easily be, sympathetic with the New Deal, it seems to me that the business elements have a good right to kick, or complain about the New Deal's poor administration. Moley turned out to be an important voice for the business viewpoint in the Roosevelt administration. Kiplinger's roots were in the traditional journalism of the Associated Press, but he crossed over into a reporting style heavy with analysis and forecasting with the Kiplinger Washington Letter. Launching the newsletter was a major struggle, and to make ends meet during this period, Kiplinger would directly participate in the political process from time to time as a campaign consultant. Kiplinger also was on the payroll, $150 a month, as an anonymous assistant and advisor for U.S. Representative Cordell Hull, Democrat of Tennessee, during his time in Congress in the 1920s. He worked for a minor Democratic presidential candidate, Governor William Ellery Sweet of Colorado, in 1924. Even in that era, when journalism ethics were being codified by the American Society of Newspaper Editors and the Society of Professional Journalists, political moonlighting arrangements by journalists would have been controversial and a conflict of interest. In many news organizations today, a reporter involved in such a consulting arrangement would be fired. Over the sweep of his career, however, Kiplinger was not openly partisan, and he dropped the outside political consulting work once the Kiplinger Washington Letter took off during the Roosevelt administration. Instead, his political role was more subtle as his journalism helped shape discourse by normalizing the New Deal regulatory state, a foreign and threatening concept for his business readers. In his reporting, he also sought to shape New Deal policy by urging the Roosevelt administration to take business leaders' concerns seriously and maintain a consistent application of rules across various industries. Kiplinger's journalism clearly stood out from the competition in one respect. He strove to explain the New Deal and its controversial aspects to business leaders, and initially minimized opposition. Early in the New Deal, during a period when business leaders were complaining about haphazard and conflicting signals from regulators, Kiplinger offered an excuse, saying the National Recovery Administration was too big a job to do all within the space of a few weeks or even a few months. It deserves sympathy. He also advanced the New Deal by acting as a type of emissary between Roosevelt's advisers. In 1934, Kiplinger said he was discussing with some administration officials the taxation proposals backed by U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. "I am doing what I can to bootleg his ideas to Morgenthau," Kiplinger wrote, referring to Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, Jr. Generally speaking, Brandeis preferred to solve the country's business problems by use of the federal taxing power, and not through the complex regulations established by the National Recovery Act. Kiplinger also tried to heal some rifts in the administration, such as the divide between Moley and Morgenthau. "In the occasional moments when I allow myself to cease being a reporter and to be a wisher for things," he told Moley, "I wish for good relations between you and Morgenthau, not particularly for his sake and not for your sake, but for the sake of the situation at large." He discussed his willingness to offer political advice. "I am afraid Tom Corcoran overestimates my ability to help Tugwell on tactical or steering advice," Kiplinger wrote to Moley, referring to Rexford Guy Tugwell, the Assistant Secretary of Agriculture, a controversial leftist, and Thomas Corcoran, a Public Works Administration attorney and an influential Roosevelt advisor. Primarily, Kiplinger provided Moley with a detailed critique of various Roosevelt administration officials, ranging from Tugwell to Commerce Secretary Daniel C. Roper to Agriculture Secretary Henry Wallace. Kiplinger even tried to suggest a constructive role for people he criticized, such as Tugwell, the leading voice for economic planning, and more aggressive curtailment of U.S. businesses. There were also instances when Kiplinger deliberately withheld damaging news about the New Deal from his readers. In a letter to Moley in August 1934, Kiplinger wrote, "If I were to print for 3 weeks running the internal facts, which I am able to check and confirm, I would wreck NRA," referring to the National Recovery Administration. Perhaps this was a boast, but the general point remained. Kiplinger did not print some material critical of the New Deal at a time when he was counseling businesses to remain patient. Kiplinger offered plenty of constructive criticism of the New Deal, however. Coverage in the Kiplinger Washington Letter, from 1932 through 1936, repeatedly described a dysfunctional bureaucracy, mixed messages from senior officials, Roosevelt's political opportunism, and sudden changes of direction. Hugh Johnson, head of the National Recovery Administration, sought to censor Kiplinger following a string of reports critical of his agency, leading to a backlash from other journalists supporting Kiplinger. Explaining the New Order. More significant than his efforts at mediation and messaging were Kiplinger's repeated warnings to his business readers that a new order was in place, one that curtailed their power. Central idea is this: government hereafter will supervise, regulate, and control private industry and trade, he wrote in May 1933. Ownership, management, and initiative will be left to private interests, but government will have power of compulsion if private initiative does.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?